un-American and apartheid is headache-driven. A storm in this world is so hard to find us. It shapes our minds the most. Maybe the mother of our nation should remind us that we're sitting too close.
Alright, hello, welcome to Days of Our Lives. Today we're going to share a little bit about CBS, a little bit about the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, what Bush's role in the Iran-Contra affair really was. We'll of course get to corporate demons in the news segment entitled The World Swing, along with a wide variety of shortcuts. Right now, Jeff is going to tell us something about CBS. Alright. Thank you, Jeff. Well, tonight we have a story for you about CBS. That's the corporate broadcasting service, or something to that effect. On June 3rd, the Jerusalem Foundation fundraiser featured an all-star media cast. Introductions were made by Perez, of the editor-in-chief of the New Republic, including remarks were given by Mort Zuckerman, who's the editor-in-chief of the U.S. News and World Report. One keynote speaker was Fuad Ajami, CBS News main analyst on Middle Eastern politics. The other keynoter was former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who served on the board of CBS Incorporated. And the moderator of the event was Dan Rather, the anchor of the CBS Evening News. Now, with all these media powerhouses present at this event, it's amazing that none of the corporate media stations found it noteworthy that Henry Kissinger made a slur against him. That was, quote, "You can't really believe anything an Arab says." Now, this June 3rd fundraiser was billed as an Israel benefit, and it was described in the New York Times as an organization that, quote, "raises money to create jobs in Jerusalem for immigrants." Now, while this may be true, the project is also intensely controversial because, in the words of a Jerusalem Foundation official, quote, "we define Jerusalem as Israel defines it," unquote, which means, of course, not only Israel's West Jerusalem, but also Palestinian East Jerusalem, occupied by Israel since the 1967 war. Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem has been condemned by the United Nations Security Council in votes that even the U.S. government supports. Israel's continued settlement of this and other occupied territories is a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Now, Dan Rather's participation in this fundraiser would seem to violate CBS's guidelines for employees' involvement in controversial disputes. According to a copy of CBS News Standards obtained by the group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, quote, "employees who in their private capacity public position on a controversial issue will either be removed from handling the news involving that issue, or, if such reassignment is not practical, be required to take a leave of absence. The rationale behind this policy is that an employee who takes such a public position loses, at minimum, the appearance of objectivity." Now, it wasn't only Dan Rather's presence at the gathering that indicated he took a partisan position on the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also several of his comments there. Quote, "Many of us celebrate 25 years after the city of Jerusalem was united under Israeli rule," he said in opening meeting. He read from a poem described as, quote, "one of my favorite poems," unquote, celebrating Israel taking control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Later, he warned that an Arab, quote, "population explosion," unquote, threatens Jerusalem. Rather also stated that Israel gets unfair treatment in the U.S. press because, quote, "Israel believes in freedom of the press," unquote, and therefore allows more negative information to be available. Now, actually, the situation is a little bit different. The Israeli government censors Palestinians in the West of Gaza and has frequently prevented U.S. reporters from covering the Palestinian uprising there. The other man, Fuad Ajami, is professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University and is a consultant to CBS News on Middle Eastern affairs. During the Gulf War, according to a study by the Freedom Forum Media Studies Center, he was the third most quoted commentator. For years, Ajami has used his appearances on CBS to show his contempt for the Arabic culture, particularly during the Gulf War. The Lebanese-born Ajami's put-downs of Arabs have resulted in some Arab-American critics nicknaming him Uncle Fuad. Describing himself as a born-again monarchist, unquote, Ajami declared, quote, "I've never really wanted democracy in any Arab or Muslim country," unquote. In fact, he and Dan Rather got into a sort of semi-argument later in the evening when Ajami claimed that, quote, "after the fall of communism, Arab nationalism is the most deadly ideology in the world," believe anything an Arab says that drew the most attention. Kissinger's defenders leapt to announce that the group's fairness and accuracy in reporting had taken the quote out of context. Now, it's difficult to imagine any context in which it would be acceptable to question the trustworthiness of the entire ethnic group. But nevertheless, CBS's immediate reaction was to stonewall. In a letter to the Arab American Anti-Defamation Committee, CBS News President Eric Ober insisted that, despite being a member of the CBS, quote, Dr. Henry Kissinger is in no way connected to this news operation, unquote, and Ajami is merely a consultant. In any case, Ober claimed that, quote, comments made by individuals in their personal capacity are not the responsibility of CBS News. Apparently, Ober failed to read his own company's news standards. So while CBS officials claimed in an August 26 meeting with the Arab American Anti-Defamation Committee representatives that if Rather had sought permission to appear at the Jerusalem fundraiser, it probably would have been denied, CBS has still not dealt seriously with the issue of bias raised by this event. As Rather commented at the June 3rd gathering, quote, one of the really great things about being a reporter is that you get to ask some of the tough questions, and you usually don't have to answer any tough questions, and that's a mighty blessing. Well, the failure of CBS to respond adequately to charges of anti-Arab prejudice shows how right you are. Jeff?
Wondered why we could back out of Iraq we're demonizing people and justify the killing of hundreds of thousands of people. In this Sunday's Grand Rapids Press, there's a fairly good article on the rising sovereignty movement in Hawaii. This coming July will mark the 100th anniversary of the U.S. Marines' illegal invasion of the island that led to the eventual foreign occupation and colonial position of the USA government. What the article failed to mention is two missionaries by the name of Captain Cook founded a banana plantation in Hawaii, an enterprise soon to be named Dole. These missionaries and their corporate ventures are what mitigated the eventual invasion of Hawaii by the USA military. The article also does not express much concern over the fact that the native people of Hawaii are not recognized by the USA government. Therefore, no legitimacy can be given to their sovereignty efforts. Halfway across the world, we're also confronted with another anniversary of nation sovereignty. This year marks the 25th anniversary of illegal occupation of the Palestinian lands by Israel. This is conveniently omitted from the corporate media since the USA government continues to fund the nation of Israel with billions of dollars annually, as well as continuing to be only one of two nations at the UN who consistently votes against recognition of Palestinian nation and Israel's illegal occupation. Israel is, of course, the other main voter. The press can casually mention the honorable position of Native Hawaiians who seek self-determination, but never do they share the plight of Palestinian people who suffer from constant harassment and brutality of the Israeli army, which now occupies 7% of the West Bank and 50% of the Gaza, all for exclusive military and separate use. The press can state that Native Hawaiians' push for sovereignty is cause for concern to the island's $9 billion annual tourism industry, but they never mention that, in fact, the first 2 years of the Intifada, from 1987 to 1989, the Israeli military detained 10,000 Palestinian children and killed some 1,000 civilians. This conscious omission of illegal practices of the U.S. government and its client states by the press reveals its racist position on people of color. Let us not be fooled by the seemingly progressive articles that the press may print. The Hawaiian sovereignty article never really threatens the present USA policy of colonialism. It only seeks to give us the impression that they are willing to print material that is critical of some of our policies. This is again an example of the corporate media's complicity in illegal USA practices around the world. We here at Days of Our Lives advocate that the USA government help liberate the Palestinian land, militarily if necessary, and then turn themselves in to the world court for their violations of internationally recognized laws which demand honoring not native sovereignty. Thank you. Jeff?
Thank you, Jeff. And speaking of international laws, here we have another story, and that story is about Iran-Contra. Now, I know those are two words that make most Americans who are in their right minds want to kick their TV sets in when they see it on the evening news, or start a nice cozy fire if they read it in their morning paper. But before you kick the set in on us, we at Days of Our Lives would just like to give you sort of our final words on the Iran-Contra affair, as far as the guilt of public officials and the complacency and complicity of the corporate media. Now, the making of the Iran-Contra story were a matter of public record long before the 1986-87 congressional damage control operations, which were called hearings, and the laughable Tower Commission report ever came out. The only part missing was that which connected the two well-known stories, and the connection is almost an irrelevancy in the face of the separate crimes committed during the Arms to Iran operation and the Contra War. Here are a few examples. Beginning with the Iran operation, by 1982, it was public knowledge that they were providing a large amount of the arms to Iran and had been since the fall of the Shah in 1979. If you doubt this, you can check your local New York Times index for the year of 1982, and you can find articles stating just that. In fact, in February 1982, the main Israeli figures whose name later appeared in the Iran-Contra hearings appeared on a BBC television program and described how they had helped organize an arms flow to the Ayatollah regime. This is public knowledge. In October of the same year, the Israeli ambassador to the United States said publicly that Israel was sending arms to Khomeini to quote, with the cooperation of the United States at almost the highest level. George Bush was at almost the highest level. The reasons he gave: to establish links with the elements in the military in Iran who might overthrow the regime, which, by the way, is illegal according to international law, and to restore the arrangements that prevailed during the reign of the first U.S. puppet, the Shah of Iran. Now, an investigative and factually correct media would have seized upon these violations of international law and U.S. constitutional law and exposed the story, and then the U.S. would have had to defend its crimes in front of the International Court of Justice. But you and I know that that's ridiculous, because our media are owned by the same people who run the rest of the country, and our government officials are above the law. And as for the illegal Contra war against the people in government of Nicaragua, most informed people knew what the U.S. was doing by 1983, and if they really had any doubts, those were cleared up in 1985, when the U.S. agent Eugene Hassenfuss and his plane were shot down over Nicaragua in the midst of a supply run to the U.S. mercenary Contra Army. The violations of human rights, Organization of American States treaties, UN agreements, other international laws, and the U.S. Constitution were even more blatant here, but the corporate media chose to wave flags and condemn this enemies just falsely, rather than report the obvious, or, heaven forbid, actually investigate the situation. So what finally forced the sloth-like corporate media in this country to start reporting on the superficial aspects of both these stories? Well, I guess captured CIA officers and National Security Council advisors handing out Bibles and chocolate cakes in the capital of Iran was just too juicy to ignore. So what are the facts that we know? We know from White House and State Department documents that George Bush attended almost all of the meetings where arms sales to Iran were. We also know that George Bush was a major cheerleader for the Contra operation, which makes him a war criminal, plain and simple. So now you see why the sum isn't nearly as significant as the parts in this story. The sooner Americans quit relying on the corporate media and congressional committees for the truth, the better off we'll all be. Jeff?
So you think that Bush will pardon Weinberger so as not to get himself in any further trouble?
Well, it's hard to say. I really can't believe that Weinberger would face any sort of real punishment, whether he was pardoned or not. I mean, it's just not the way things happen to people who are in power, as you know quite well.
Last week, the Grand Rapids Press ran a short article entitled, quote, Mobil Oil agrees to pay Clean Air fine of $950,000, unquote. The article goes on to say that the Environmental Protection Agency had charged that the Mobil polyethylene foam plant in Bakersfield exceeded limits on emissions of volatile organic compounds from 1983 to 1985. With that, we are disgusted to announce here on Days of Our Lives that this week's corporate demon is Mobil Oil Company. Founded in the 1800s as Standard Oil of New York, they have conducted several dozen takeovers of other businesses to become one of the largest petroleum companies in the world. They're also involved in real estate, mining, and mineral extraction. They own their own tanker fleet and are involved in the chemical business as well. In the early 1970s, they, along with Shell and BP, approached the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, known as MIT, to conduct a study advising them of new areas of possess. The answer that came back was the genetic supply industry. This has meant the development of new crop varieties that are unstable, thus making farmers dependent upon companies like Mobil to supply them wheat and fossil fuel-based fertilizer. Mobil also is the owner of TAPS, which stands for the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline System, an 800-mile pipeline from Alaska's northern slope to the port of Valdez in the south. We here at Days of Our Lives don't need to remind our viewers of the grave evils of oil production and its use, but essentially, companies like Mobil have wreaked more havoc on the planet than most of the corporate demons that we have shown on past shows. Mobil is part of an industry that instigates a social order which has made us addicted to fossil fuels, thus creating numerous environmental disasters and justifying political and military policies that oppress people throughout the world. But apparently, these facts are not known to a lot of people, and there are reasons for this. In the 1970s, amidst the so-called energy crisis, companies like Mobil were accusing the corporate media of giving them a bad rap. In order to combat this bad press, Mobil public relations manager Kirk Schmertz began a magazine and newspaper advocacy that really set the stage for most corporate PR, especially in this age of green business. Since then, Mobil has been taking out full-page ads in the New York Times lauding the benefits of the oil industry. These ads appeared frequently in 1980, and as Randall Cole stated, quoting, quote, since 1972, in fact, Mobil has become almost a regular Times columnist, speaking out often as nearly as William Safire and Lewis, unquote. Mobil spends millions of dollars annually on advertising, which is nothing, since last year alone they made $868 million on interest from their $62 billion made in sales. So how many times have you seen commercials that show beautiful wildlife scenes with Mozart music helping to bring tears to your eyes, and then the announcer for Mobil says, we're doing our part to protect the planet? This strategy is effective simply because groups like Greenpeace afford to give you a different viewpoint. PR has ultimately become a form of manipulation and damage control for those times when the truth weakens. For example, Mobil makes hefty trash bags. In 1990, they were marketing a bag that was supposed to be biodegradable. This was simply not true, and they removed the false ads because of the number of lawsuits brought against them. While negotiating their way out of the lawsuits, the company, quote, pretty much admitted they had been knowingly misleading the public, unquote, says Joel Makeower, editor of Consumer Butters. And if this isn't demonic enough, well, we have more. According to Jonathan Feldman's book, Universities in the Business of Repression, Mobil does business in South Africa. And during the height of the anti-apartheid demonstrations and divestment movements here in the United States, Mobil Oil, along with the U.S. State Department and some South African officials, held a conference on universities in South Africa. One of the topics discussed was how to block anti-apartheid sit-ins and shantytowns. An attorney representing Virginia State University suggested that legal maneuvers based on the university's property rights would be useful to get around students' free speech protections. And in addition, Mobil has also done numerous mining extractions on native lands in South Dakota, thus violating treaty rights, legal land, and its people. After the show tonight, we'd like you to call this 1-800 number we got from our 1-800-ECO-RAPE list and tell Mobil Oil what stop polluting the earth, stop raising our planet. Maybe they can invest in mass transit. Thank you. Jeff?
All right, thanks for that wonderful corporate demon, as always. Well, hello again. Tonight, in that fine dual tradition, I'm starting a new segment entitled A World to Win. Now, in subsequent weeks, you'll see a beautiful little hammer and sickle sort of fading into a dove, but I wasn't quite ready for today, so. This segment's going to deal with revolutionary movements throughout the world. The segment really focused on arms movements, but we'll also deal with nonviolent movements for radical change. Tonight I'm going to cover the armed revolutionary struggle in Colombia, with its most potent guerrilla organizations, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia and the National Liberation Army. The Colombian insurgency has been organized and active since 1965, giving it the status of longest-running revolutionary movement in the Western Hemisphere. Not exactly an honor for a revolutionary movement, but alas. So let's examine some of the conditions that prevail in Colombia and state an armed struggle. Colombia, commonly called a democracy by the U.S. media, is a totalitarian land of vast social injustices. The two political parties which share political power are both owned by the oligarchy, according to former President Alfonso Lopez Michael Franti. Any political party which deviates from the status quo is threatened with extermination. In 1988 and 89, political killings averaged 11 a day. Over a third of the members of paramilitary groups engaged in political killings and other terrorist acts are active duty officers in the Colombian military. And according to Amnesty International, death squads have deep ties to the state security forces. Disappearance and execution of labor, Indian, and community leaders is a regular part of daily life. There's a calculated assault on the campesino movement to reverse the effects of earlier Colombian land reforms. The military makes a habit of evicting small landholders and driving campesinos from disputed lands, their only acceptable position being chief field hands. In fact, life has deteriorated to such an extent that a field laborer had a better chance of making a living in the 1800s than that person would today. The U.S. government has had its hand in all of this, of course, latest pretext being the drug war. The Colombian security forces have largely been trained by U.S. advisors, and of the much-touted drug war money to combat narco-traffickers, 77% was used in the counterinsurgency campaign in ways totally unrelated to combating drug flow. This all serves the United States interest in the region. According to James Brooks of the New York Times, the government has been able to confine the guerrillas to remote rural areas. However, Voice, the voice of the Colombian Communist Party, stated, "The government now marks 2 years of a continuous and intense military activity against the guerrillas, with all the maximum war power, without succeeding in decimating or even limiting the action of the guerrilla group." Indeed, according to Horacio Serpa Uribe, formerly the government's chief negotiator with the guerrillas have only advanced militarily. Earlier this year, they dynamited an oil pipeline, a wave of attacks on oil installations. Recently, they isolated the city of Yopal, blocking the highway and cutting telephone communications as part of an intercity bus stoppage. And 2 weeks ago, they conducted a raid in which 26 police were killed, and this, in conjunction with other raids, prompted the government to impose a 90-day state of emergency. The recent guerrilla actions are threatening President Cesar Gaviria Trujillo's plans to have Colombia become one of the Western Hemisphere's major oil exporters in the 1990s. Newly discovered oil fields lie smack dab in the middle of the guerrilla cold. Unfortunately, this could mean greater U.S. intervention. John Lixblau, chairperson of the Petroleum Industry Research Group, stated, "It is in our geopolitical interest to lessen dependence on the Middle East, but if Colombia's guerrilla cuts a pipeline every other week, it's not going to be very secure." So that could pose danger for the Colombian guerrilla. Either way, increased government pressure doesn't seem to save the guerrilla. Said a spokesperson, "If the government comes out with more militarism, we'll just have to go on the offensive." All right, Jeff, I guess you're going to tell us a little bit about an article in the press about Guatemala.
I must say that for the years that I've been reading the Grand Rapids Press, and especially in regards to their coverage of Central America, I've been shocked at the seemingly accurate reporting on an article that appeared in Sunday's press. We can have that first graphic up on the screen. It's amazing that the article actually had a lot of accurate figures and facts about the state of reality in Guatemala. And the second image that you're going to see, it even gives a listing of figures of people who have been disappeared, who have been murdered, and who have been displaced from the country. Some of the things they said I'd like to quote just to give you a sense of the information they're giving. The government's goal is simple: to preserve the traditional arrangement under which the Indian half of the population has been available as a source of labor, so hungry and so cheap that their condition verges on slavery. They also quote Rigobert Menchú, who recently won a Nobel Peace Prize, by saying that 2 young women associated with Rigobert were gang raped by soldiers and left in the streets shortly after announcement of the trial. They also state that in the 80s, the 400-some villages were burned and razed, that 2% of the population owns 70% of the land in the country, and that 80% of its children suffer from malnutrition, and 1 in 8 dies before the age of 5, according to the Ministry of Health and this is quite an amazing article from the Grand Rapids Press. But one reads it more closely with the looking eye. Right in the middle of the article, they state this. There have been efforts to explain Guatemala in the Cold War terms that were used to form U.S. public opinion about El Salvador and Nicaragua. But though the Guatemalan government has tried to portray the resistance as communist-inspired, it doesn't place the reason in Washington, which has cut off military aid. The United States government is again the righteous defender of human dignity in this hemisphere. This is a blatant lie. Nowhere in the article do they say that the U.S. government and corporations are the root cause for the present conditions in Guatemala. Thus, this paragraph completely negates all the statistics facts about Guatemala. Please, folks, do not be confused or fooled by such blatant lies that we do from the Grand Rapids Press. Yes?
Alright, can we please have the day's 3 graphic on the screen? It's entitled Pro-Choice. Yeah. Alright, this lovely little Bloomingdale's ad appeared in the New York Times, and it's a doozy. The ad goes on to say, if you like bells, swell. If you like it straight, great. See, with choices like these, I don't see what all you women are complaining about. Once again, the corporate media has managed to reduce an issue of vital importance to most of the United States to a marketing ploy. But hey, the type of pro-choice they're touting seems quite in line with the family values, mindless, subservient roles this nation believes respect to me. And maybe this is no coincidence. I guess we've come to the end of the show. Next week we're going to have a call-in, probably talk a little bit about the poor in this country. And you'll be going to Puerto Rico, right?
Yeah, I'll be leaving for 2 weeks to do a little research and hopefully have some good information when I come back.
That'll be great. We're looking forward to that. I'm hoping to see you all here again next week. These are our lives.
Radiation on television. The drug of the nation, breeding ignorance and feeding radiation TV. It's satellite linked by United States of Unconsciousness. Apathetic, therapeutic, and extremely addictive. The methadone methanol, pumping out 150 channels 24 hours a day. You can flip through all of them, and still there's nothing worth watching. TV is the reason why less than 10% of people